Hi, my name's Dr Adam Booth and welcome to another locked down edition of Quantum Source. Now, at Quantum Source, we're a big fan of the tenuous research link, but this one is tenuous even by Quantum Source standards, but stick with it, let's see where it goes. Early in lockdown, supermarkets reported that people seemed to be buying more flour. And also Google reported that people were searching more frequently for instructions about making sourdough. Presumably they couldn't get any yeast in the supermarkets, and so they resorted to the natural yeasts that occur in the air to make sourdough. And then social media erupted with people's sourdough creations. I'm not one of those people. I can't really follow instructions when it comes to recipes, but I have just taken delivery of a nice sourdough loaf from Farsley's Mill Kitchen, so big up the mill. I'm looking forward to having it for a bit of lunch on my deck under a cloudless sky. Now then, clouds, sourdough and clouds might sound like a hipster's travel agency, but don't otherwise seem to be particularly related, do they? Well, or so you'd think. There's a researcher within the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds who says that he can draw a link between the biological processes that go on within sourdough and the physical processes that go on in cloud formation. £5 on this, Craig. In a few minutes we're going to be talking to Dr Craig Poku. He's a researcher in cloud physics. But first of all, our recommended source. Now, the sourdough equivalent for beer is lambic beer, a sour beer that just uses kind of the wild natural yeasts. But I don't have any to recommend, and I don't really like it, to be honest. Apologies to all the lambic beer experts out there. So the sauce that I'm recommending is a little bit of my dad's homemade piccalilli, which will go perfectly well with a sourdough cheese sandwich. So thanks very much, Dad. This one's for you. And you get yourself something nice. We'll give Craig a call. Cheers. Hello, Craig. Good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam. How are you doing?
Awesome. I'm very good, and all the better for having taken a sourdough delivery. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that. You've got sourdough around your place as well, right?
Yes. So I actually made a loaf this morning for purposes of this call.
Oh, wow.
I'm very excited to show that off at a later point. So yeah.
Cool. Right. Let's go for it. But just before we do, what sauce are you enjoying with a nice sourdough?
Now, Adam, there are multiple sauces that I like to enjoy during this period of lockdown. However, right now, I'm going to say that my favourite happens to be the finest Black Dog gin. And if I could have any form of powers that would change this, I'd ideally want, it would have to be the rhubarb and ginger Edinburgh gin, which I highly recommend. Unfortunately, that's finished. I don't want to ever admit that, and yet I just have on camera. So that's going to be fun.
But you've got gin, all's good, right? It's still all good.
Oh, totally agreed. And it was either gin or a glass of white wine, which I've also got chilling in the fridge at the moment. But we don't need to talk about that. No.
Let's talk clouds and sourdough. Now, I've got £5 here that says that you can, or you can't. I don't know. Either way, £5, right? You're going to link clouds and sourdough together. You obviously got feet in both the cloud camp and the sourdough camp. Just start off, frame it. Why are we interested in cloud physics?
So cloud physics is a very interesting field because, one, clouds are all around us. But there are two main reasons why we should care about clouds. The first reason is that they have a direct impact on climate. So in order for us to be insulated from solar radiation, clouds can actually have the ability to reflect that solar radiation back into the atmosphere. But the second reason why they're also important is because they are useful for water management. So places that are very heavily dependent on water management, they actually need to ensure that you have a good understanding of cloud physics so that you can kind of manage what you're going to be doing, etc., etc. But for my particular field, the reason why cloud physics is important is that I specialize in fog, and fog has a decrease in the near surface visibility, which consequently can have an impact on human health and society. So that's the reason why we should care about cloud physics a bit more. To try and understand this is better.
Because I think that, most people would probably say, it's predicting when it's going to rain. But you're actually saying it's predicting how warm it's going to be as well with all this reflection. And it's predicting potentially, road traffic accidents or something like that. So
Agreed. What I find so interesting about cloud physics is before I entered the field of cloud physics, I literally saw it as we need to know about clouds so then we know when it's going to rain. But then the further I've now got into understanding cloud physics, the more I realize how much it has an impact on our society. Mostly in the topic of climate, which is something that a lot of us are now hearing about more and more. And there are so many processes that go into the formation of clouds that it's a very complicated subject. And that's why I think I enjoy it so much, because there's so many questions that some of them we have the answers to and others we don't.
Yeah. And some of them are helped by first understanding the processes that go on in sourdough, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let's come back to the clouds in a bit, and then we can really assess whether you've earned that £5. Tell us about sourdough, your adventures in sourdough, and why we should care.
Why should we care about sourdough? Sourdough, fundamentally, it consists of flour, water, salt, and thyme. And therefore, it means that the majority of us have the ingredients in our cupboards to make sourdough. Whereas with other breads, we may not necessarily have a packet of yeast like lying about. But the reason why I also like sourdough is that because it's built around natural bacteria, there's actually been a number of studies which have shown that sourdough can be really good in terms of helping your digestive system. But the reason I really enjoy sourdough is that it's very minimal effort for you to have a really good product. And actually, what you may find is that, yes, it does take longer for you to make sourdough, but the amount of effort to put onto your side, you don't require to do any kneading. You don't have to worry about like making sure that you've hit the first rise or the second rise sufficiently. All you just need to do is have some patience and some time, and you'll get brilliant bread every time.
Right. I'm going to put that one to the test. In my intro, I was saying that I find it really difficult to follow recipes and stuff like that. But actually, you're saying that almost makes me a perfect candidate for being a sourdough baker. Just put the stuff together and leave it.
Well, that's actually really a good point. So what a lot of people do when they start baking, this is not just with sourdough, but this was baking as a whole, and I've made this mistake, is that you assume that the first time you're going to do it, it's going to be Instagram professional, it's going to get you into all of the cooking shows, it's going to be like cookbook ready. And the reality is that that's not necessarily the case. However, I think the reason why people are fearful of sourdough is because it's got such it's highly regarded within the bread community that people don't think is approachable. And I actually think that what is now happening, now that we've got more time on our hands, is that people are going, actually, let me see if I can dedicate some time to making some sourdough. Mm. And so as a baker myself, I find it really exciting when I see everybody on my social media feeds going, oh my gosh, I've just made my first sourdough loaf.
Right.
Because it's not a difficult concept, but I think that it's the approach and the idea of using natural bacteria that can be quite off-putting to a lot of people. We're actually finding that in this particular instance, it's quite necessary for you to have good bread. Mm. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I saw like, there was reports coming from shops that were saying that, people had bought more flour, and then people, it did seem, were searching for sourdough on Google, and obviously they are experimenting with it, and they're starting it up.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of sources, so when the world turned a bit funny over the last few weeks, yeah. What was quite interesting is that you couldn't find most supplies anywhere. But we're now 3 months into the world being funny, and flour is still quite a difficult thing to get a hand. And it's not to say that we've run out of flour, but it's more the fact that for flour mill, the majority of their sources go to big industry. So, for example, companies such as Donald's and G. I don't want to say anything because I don't want this to be like copyright infringed in any way. But unfortunately, you find that a lot of their flour goes to these big companies. And so now as home bakers, we're now actually like buying more flour. If you then end up doubling your production by 2, like doubling your production, you then end up finding that it's now causing a much higher demand. And that's the reason why we can't get hold of flour. But what I'm really happy to see is that when people are getting uses of flour, they go, let's make some bread.
Yeah.
Or let's make some cakes, or let's do something that before we're used to living in the world where we're going, we don't have enough time to do stuff. And we've now gone from having not enough time to do stuff to having all the time. Yeah. And baking is quite therapeutic. So all of these things are all positives in my mind. Yes, of course, it means that trying to get flour is a nightmare. But when you do get flour, you go, I've got so many possibilities. And that's what's quite exciting.
Yeah. So whereas people would have been commuting, they've now got a bit more time spent in the kitchen, spent with the family or something. So, yeah, cool. Yeah.
So like, one thing what I'm finding now is because I've got so much time to do stuff, I'm then going, why don't I try this? Or why don't I try that? I've only been making sourdough for a few months, so I kind of jumped on the sourdough train before everyone else did. But now that I've got all of this time, it's now giving me the opportunity to work out, why do we do the steps that we need to do to get to the bread that we have?
Right.
And I suspect, this was going to be a natural progression in itself. As a scientist, I want to know why.
Yeah.
And so whenever it came to me going, okay, so I've been making all of this bread, how can I make it better? So I then said to myself, well, actually, if, say, for example, I understand a bit of the science, then that will then hopefully result in a better product. So, in a way, did a lot of research, and then afterwards, now I apply this research to my general baking, and I'm finding that I'm getting better results on a more consistent basis as a result.
Yeah. So what are you testing out there? What is the science behind the sourdough then?
So sourdough is built on a network of wild yeast. This wild yeast lives everywhere in our atmosphere, but of flour grains, it's in abundance. So the general gist of it is that in order for you to have sourdough, you need to have what's known as a sourdough starter. The sourdough starter is consisted of both water and flour being mixed in a form of dough. Now, on these grains, you have wild yeast, as I just mentioned, but you also have an abundance of lactic bacteria. And what will happen is when you mix your flour and water together, you start a process known as autolysis. Autolysis simply just means that it just helps the dough basically gain in elasticity and flavor. And within autolysing, you have an enzyme that's triggered that's known as amylase. Long story short, the amylase breaks down the sugar, the starches to form sugars, and then over time, these sugars are then fed. These sugars then feed the bacteria as well as the yeast. You then have a starter. You can use a starter to then make sourdough bread.
Okay.
Yes.
So what have you been testing out then?
So I think things I've mostly been testing out are, one, does the type of flour improve your starter? Two, how does your combination of flours also have an impact on the final product? And for me, the most important thing is, how can I incorporate color using natural flavors?
Right.
So an example being quite recently is I have been quite obsessed with introducing beetroots into bread.
Okay.
Session came
like whole beetroots, you just throw one in.
What? Just literally just go, here's the whole beetroot
in. The leaves poking out the top, yeah?
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? That would be both intriguing and terrifying at the same time. But more in the case that I wanted the colour of beetroots into being my bread. So the idea of pink bread fascinated me. And I suspect it was probably from watching last year's Bake Off, where I saw them do all these coloured breads, and I went, I want to be able to do that.
Right.
So I went, okay, well, beetroots are red. And if I put red into bread, then I should then get bread, correct?
Yeah.
But beetroots actually oxidize. And so what will happen is that under high heat, they will then oxidize and then turn from this really brilliant, vibrant red to a beige. And
so kind of the colour of bread anyway, right?
Which it is. For months, I was then trying to work out, why am I starting with pink dough, and I'm going from a pink dough to a beige dough when I bake it? And it turns out that beetroots have pigments within beetroots are very unstable. And so in order for you to stabilize them, you either need to introduce an antioxidant or you need to make the environment more acidic. So that was an experiment of me trying to go, how can I introduce more colors? And I think in combination of me understanding why a starter is what it is, then I was then able to go, well, if I combine lemon juice, for example, then that kind of tackles both the acidity. The sourdough starter is also quite acidic as well. Therefore, I should get pink bread. And I did get pink bread eventually. And I was so proud. But
Cool.
also, the other thing as well is I mentioned how flour and water over time will then break down, will then result in you having an environment of lactic bacteria or lactic acid, as well as these wild yeast. However, let's say, for example, I used white flour versus rye flour. Rye flour is what's considered as a dark flour, and therefore they are more abundant in these. They're a lot more abundant in both these lactic bacteria as well as these wild yeast. So I'm now finding that by me feeding my starter with both white flour and rye flour, I'm getting a much stronger starter as opposed to when I just feed it with white flour. And that's due to the fact that by introducing more lactic bacteria, you then introduce more wild yeast, and therefore you then get a much stronger product.
Okay.
That's an example of me just doing some experimentation. And I'm finding this whole experimenting phase quite exciting because sometimes I get brilliant products and other times I get duds. We don't talk about the duds.
Come on, talk about the duds. Have you got, is today's a dud or is it a brilliant product?
I'm going to say that today is a brilliant product.
Oh, I'm gutted. I was hoping to put you on the spot and you'd have to show us a dud.
Well, if you had this conversation with me, say a week ago, then I would have said, yeah, it was a bit of a dud.
I should say that we were scheduled to do this talk 1 week ago. And look, he's engineered it. Oh, sorry, Adam, I can't make it today. Can we push it back a week? Rumble you.
So here is the sourdough loaf that I did earlier today.
All right. So what's telling you that that's a good one?
So there are a few kind of key indicators. The first thing is the height. So for reference, when I put it in the oven, it was about that high.
Right.
So now you can see that it's really grown in the oven.
Yeah.
The second thing to also see as well is that we can also see that we've got some really nice air bubbles forming.
Yeah.
So this is a sign of the gluten structure being quite strong. So the idea behind it is because you're not kneading your dough, you need another way for you to develop these gluten strands. Gluten is a form of proteins. Proteins are found in flour. And you've got two types of gluten strands. You've got gliadines and glutenines. When combined with water, you then form gluten. And what you find is that the longer these strands are, the more CO2 they can hold. So the reason why this is a good loaf is because you can see that these gluten strands have been able to hold all of these air bubbles.
Right.
The other thing as well is that it's also got a really pretty crust. So, so this is a sign of just really good scoring across the board. And this bit here, what you get is if you cut your bread deep enough, what will happen is that as it's then growing, it wants to go to the point of the weakest point, as it will just kind of explode out of itself.
Right.
That's mostly for artistic purposes, but you want to also, but the benefit of doing that as well is that you end up knowing where your cracks are going to be. So rather than you having a massive crack at the bottom of the loaf, you've got a crack, say, at the top of the loaf.
Cool. Bring it back into the middle of the camera. Bring it back into the middle of the screen. Let's just do a bit of a swirl. Show off the top.
I feel like in one of those beauty guru makeup videos where they just go, can you see it?
Yeah. It's a nice sourdough, mate. So, like, the Mill Kitchens, right? This is just a slice of theirs. What's going on with that?
So you can see here that firstly, it's got a really good crust, which then means that, so as a complete aside, in order for you to have a good crust, you need to bake your bread in steam. Now, professional kitchens have this steam injected at all times. A conventional oven does not have. So there are two ways you can do this. You can either cook your bread in a Dutch oven, which then means that you are then capturing the process of you having the steam from the bread itself, then essentially cooking the outside of the bread. Or the second thing is what I do is that you actually just get a tray, heat it up and pour water into it. So if you go back to the loaf that you bought there, you can see that you can tell that it's done a really good bake, because if you look, you see really good crust.
Right.
And that really good crust, and because you're cooking within a humid environment, it then allows for the bread to then expand. Also notice as well that it's got really good crumb structure, which then demonstrates the fact that actually the gluten has been very well developed. And I also bet it tastes amazing at the same time too. Am I right?
Pretty good, mate.
So I haven't tasted my loaf yet. I will have a slice at a later point, but I need to take some photos of it first. This is the choice of being an Instagram person. I can only apologize.
If people want to see your creations, what's your Instagram?
My Instagram is Poku Bakes. That's spelled Poku Bakes.
All right, there you go. Check out Poku Bakes. Nice one.
Yes.
So, we've talked sourdough. You've got me to eat some sourdough. Now we come to £5 time.
Before I begin, will you be sending this £5 through like the postal lockdown service?
Oh, we got to take the votes from the audience first, mate. You know, we got to poll it.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is just your starter for 5. So there's a lot of loaded words in that one, isn't there?
Oh.
Right. So let's think clouds then. You gave us why clouds are important. What about that sourdough biology and the biological processes tells us something about the way that clouds form?
Okay. So to sort of summarize, the majority of clouds are formed through what's known as Adiabatic Ascent. So the idea behind it is that you have a parcel of air that rises up in the atmosphere, and then as this parcel expands, it then cools, and then eventually it can reach a state what's known as saturation. Saturation then being the point where you then have cloud formation. Now, how fast this parcel will rise will then determine how big your cloud is. Okay. So you find that much shallower clouds will tend to have a much slower ascent, as opposed to, say, something like a cumulus cloud, which are really big and fluffy. And
they're your proper cauliflower clouds, like.
Yeah, your proper cauliflower clouds tend to usually have quite high level, like high adiabatic ascents.
Okay.
And so you can sort of relate that to the height of this.
Right.
So the idea behind it is that the reason why this has got a good height is because it's got what's known as maximum oven spring. So oven spring, in simple terms, is how high can your bread become? And there are ways in which we can actually improve the oven spring. So the first example would be the way how your starter is. So in order for you to have maximum oven spring, you want to make sure that your starter is super active. And because if it's not super active, that means that you're then going to get a really weak bread. And you can sort of relate this to the atmosphere, because I like to think of a really super active starter having the right humidity and temperature. And so therefore, in order for you to maximize cloud formation, you need to have the right kind of like environmental setup.
Right.
The other thing as well, and I think the more kind of like easier example is that a lot of us cook our sourdough breads in a Dutch oven. Now, I don't own a Dutch oven, and I cook my sourdough on this. So if you just give me one moment.
Right. We're down to £4.99, mate.
Hold on. That was supposed to be a lot smoother. If you can just edit a little bit of that out, that'd be great. Let's rephrase that a bit. So I cook my sourdough loaf on this. So this is a heated tray, as you can see here. Standard oven tray. Now, because wild yeast, so one thing to note is that conventional yeast that you buy in the packet has been designed to have the fastest reaction time. However, with wild yeast, that reaction time is a lot slower. So what you will find is that because it's a lot slower, if you imagine that because it's a lot slower, that means that it can basically die in the oven much quicker. That's the easiest way to sort of think about it. Now, if I cook my bread on this tray, I've essentially added an additional heat from the bottom, and therefore I've made the bread environment a lot more unstable. And that is sort of what's happening in the atmosphere. So the idea behind it is that if, say, for example, I have a concrete surface versus a heated surface versus a grass surface, for example, the concrete surface can absorb more heat and has a high heat capacity, which then means that that local bit of the boundary layer or our atmosphere is a lot more unstable, meaning that you can actually then have what's known as convection trigger. Right. And that convection, depending on its strength, can actually then result in you then having much bigger clouds forming.
So you're saying that cities form big clouds, basically?
So cities form big clouds. So the cloud formation over urbanized areas can sort of vary in the sense that some sources argue that actually you'll get less cloud formation. Others say that you actually get more cloud formation. I'm not an urban meteorologist, so I don't know enough about this. Right. But what I can say, however, is that you'll find that the levels of convection sometimes within urban settings, or better yet, with surfaces that can store heat better, will be a much stronger level. However, if, say, for example, you then don't have the right environment, so it's not very humid, then you'll then find that you then get very minimal cloud formation, as an example.
Okay.
But,
so, go on.
No, you carry on.
Yeah. So I was going to say, you were also saying about, you know about cloud formation, but then you look at kind of fog.
Yeah.
How's cloud and fog different? Where's the divide? And is there anything we can learn from sourdough there?
So fog is different to clouds in the sense that fog is at the surface, whereas clouds aren't.
Okay.
The way how fog reaches saturation is through a process known as radiative cooling. So the way I think about it is that the ground and the lower levels of the atmosphere absorb heat. And then once you then reach the nocturnal part of the day, i.e. nighttime, then that heat is then released through a process of radiative cooling. Under the right conditions, you can get sufficient levels of radiative cooling within the UK such that you then have fog formation. And you may be going, but how on earth does that relate to, say, clouds as opposed to, say, how does that relate to, say, sourdough? Now, do you know, you're probably aware of what a focaccia is, right?
Yeah. It's Italian bread with a lot of salt on the top.
Yes, that's right. Now, a lot of people, what I'm now finding is that a lot of people I know not only are making, like, say, sourdough loaves, but they're now using sourdough in everything. One of them is focaccia. And traditionally, focaccia incorporates the use of oil. Now, you may be going, how does oil have an impact on bread? If you imagine these gluten strands trying to form, what oil will do is that it will essentially prohibits the formation of some of these gluten strands, which then means that you'll then find that you then get a much tighter crumb structure, closer to like a sandwich bread, as opposed to the big holes that we're finding here. Right. Sourdough is a form of bean dough, focaccia is not. Okay. Therefore, you can add the same amount of starter in, say, for example, both the sourdough and the focaccia. You can have the same levels of ingredients and everything, and you can cook it in exactly the same way. But you will then find that the height is completely different due to the fact that focaccia has oil and sourdough doesn't.
And so the focaccia doesn't trap the air in the same way?
Yeah, like it traps the air, but the gluten strands are just a lot smaller. So therefore, you will find that you just get much smaller air bubbles. Okay. Now, maybe go, how on earth does this have anything to do with fog and clouds?
How on earth?
So radiative cooling is a much slower cooling process as opposed to, say, adiabatic ascent. And whilst adiabatic ascent is dependent on the change in pressure, the radiative cooling is not. So you can have the same cooling rate, hypothetically speaking, for both a cloud and, say, fog, but you will then find that overall the radiative cooling aspect will then have a completely different physical effect. So the reason I like to think about like this is that the oil relates to radiated cooling like the non-oil relates to adiabatic ascent, hence why you can relate clouds and sourdough together. End of lesson, boom.
Boom. Right, Craig, we're going to say thanks very much for this now. Here endeth the lesson, as you said. If anyone has any other questions for Craig, or indeed would like to check out his sourdough, then you can catch him on Instagram. Your Twitter handle was...
It's C_Poku93.
Right. Or you can post questions to the Quantum Source Twitter feed, and Craig can see them as well. And I'm sure he'd be happy to debate with you the finer points of sourdough and clouds.
Yes. I think also one thing to say as well, like there is an organisation I'd like to actually thank. So they're called the Real Bread Campaign.
Okay.
They're a charity that are based in London, which one of their primary focuses is to get people to make more sourdough bread. They reached out to me to actually help me with some of the science behind sourdough. So in the sense that they explained to me the idea that flour grains are abundant with both these lactic bacteria as well as wild yeast. And that's why it's a really good environment for this sort of like starter to thrive, which is something that I got slightly incorrect. And part of the reason I want to mention them is because they're a really awesome charity. We should all support them.
Cool. There we go. Right. You heard it all here. We got clouds, we got sourdough, we got charity support, we got real life action science. So, yeah, thanks very much, Craig. And yeah, no worries at all. And we'll see you soon.
Right, see you soon. Take care.
Bye.
So how did he do? We got clouds, we got sourdough, but did Craig really do enough to convince you that there isn't a tenuous link between the two? You can let us know at the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram accounts, where you'll also find the latest updates on fascinating facts and educational entertainment to keep you sane during the lockdown. Just remains for me to say that I've been Dr. Adam Booth, this has been some Mill Kitchen Sourdough, this has been Quantum Source, and you've been great. Thanks very much.